Hey, everybody, welcome to this episode of the Hope for the Soul podcast. We're glad that you've joined us today. It is another episode where it's just two of us, not three of us. A couple weeks ago, my dad was fired up and ready to talk, and then he got a phone call, and we had to abort the mission because he had to go take care of some other stuff. So then the week after that, Dad was out of town, and you're here today. So we're going to dive into what you were fired up and ready to talk about. It still sounds like you're fired up. So
The issue has become
move the mic a little closer.
the issue has become since this was our scheduled discussion a couple of weeks ago. This has cooked for 2 weeks, and it has simmered and cooked.
So
and
it's simmering.
there's at least 2 episodes here. I might get a whole monthly series out of this thing.
It's great. The bad news is we don't get a corny Kayla joke today. So
Yeah.
but
I did hear another joke the other day, and we're sending it to her. I think it would bless this ministry.
yeah.
And so,
But if we know the punchline, she's not going to say it here because the punchline I think is more for us than it is the listeners.
well, like I've said before, I enjoy her telling the joke more than I like the joke.
That's the truth. That's
Because-
Douglas Hicks and her right
Because
there.
you see the laugh growing in her as she progresses in the joke, and by the time she gets to the punchline and just erupts, I'm laughing at the eruption.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So today is part one of a two-part
Okay,
series.
that'll work.
So we're going to dive in and talk about what we planned to talk about a couple weeks ago. So let's just get right to the point. Let's go quick today.
Okay, well, first off, I think that I would like to. Often on podcasts, we don't necessarily give a title to what we're talking about, but I'd like to discuss this subject matter, and that is simply the anatomy of an ethical crisis.
Wow.
The anatomy of an ethical crisis. Have you ever found yourself in a tight spot as a pastor, as a leader? I know you have. I know one time you came to me and you told me you had made a decision. And then about a month later, you didn't ask me about the decision before. And then about a month or 6 weeks later, you came back to me and says, Dad, you have to help me get out of this thing that I've done.
Yeah.
And I like telling this story to my friends when we're comparing in next generation leadership, because I will say, well, son, I didn't get you in this mess. And so you're going to get yourself out of it. And I have a big laugh with the story, but you ever been in that moment when you're in a tight spot or a difficult place and you're faced with a decision? You have to make a decision.
Oh.
And in that moment, when you have to make this decision, it doesn't matter what you decide. You can't win for losing. I mean, if you answer A is going to have its bad consequences, answer B is going to have its consequences, and so you just don't know what to do, and you know it at this point. Whatever we do is going to be painful.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I like to describe as a definition for an ethical crisis. Is in that place when you've got to make a decision, and it's not an easy one. It's difficult, and there's probably a right one, but even the right one might even be more painful than the wrong answer would be. You see, both decisions can be right type, or they could both be wrong, but because you're torn between the two, you find yourself in your mind, you get frustrated, you get confused, even cloudy.
Yeah.
You also find yourself many times feeling that feeling down in your chest that kind of comes up,
Oh, yeah.
which is that's an emotional feeling. And so you may be torn between a head decision and a heart decision. And so you find yourself in this moment of an ethical crisis. And if you find yourself with more than you got two or three things going on at that time, you may find yourself dealing with more than one crisis, but you may be actually dealing with crises. I mean, you got crisis, CRISIS, crises, which is CRISES, which means you got problems going in and
Yeah.
you got problems going out. And
The
so
fires are many.
these things occur in every career path. They occur in every workplace. They occur in every family. And they seem like they especially occur when you're leading other people because you find yourself dealing with others, trying to navigate their situations. And most time, the crisis that we are dealing with is not even of our own making. I mean, we're trying to solve something that we had nothing to do with. We got tossed into this thing, and everybody's looking at us, expecting us to fix it. I mean, over the years, I can't tell you the times that we have young couples or maybe an engaged couple or something, and their parents and family want the pastor to fix all of this, or a young person, a teenager. In reality, I can't fix this. It should have been fixed at home 10 years ago. But you find yourself torn. What? How do I answer this? How do I respond? Because and most ethical crises we find ourselves in are not even of our own making. Now we can make our own crisis, okay? But most times there's another player in this thing, and so their crisis has created a crisis for you, and now you're trying to deal with your own situations, and and also trying to navigate and help them with theirs, and it creates this storm, and a lot of times it even wants us to shut down and do nothing, kind of like we go on mental paralysis. I just don't know what to do, so we're not gonna do anything. So with this, you feel this emotional pressure, you feel this mental pressure, but also you feel in the moment, you feel this dread in the moment. Oh God, what am I going to do? I don't want to fool with this. It's kind of like the lady went and, and looked under the bed and said, Johnny, you've got to go to school today. And he says, I don't want to go to school today. She says, you have to go to school today because you're the principal.
Yeah.
And so it's that moment when you're dreading what's going on, and these crises that they create these emotional moments for us. So when we're faced with such a crisis, we're facing such moments. It's been now this is not a dissertative type uh, problem solving thing. But from my view, the way I view this, I haven't taken this from an outline or some class or something, but this is the three things I found myself having to deal with when I'm faced with an ethical crisis. First off, there's three of them. I want to deny it. Second off, I want to defer it. Or when I really come to myself, I want to deal with it. But I never start with the deal with it mode. I mean, first off, we just hope this thing goes away. We just want to. It's not even an issue, but you see, I've come to learn that when you don't resolve an issue, that an unresolved issue never resolves itself.
Yeah.
It tends to grow.
Mhm.
I like to say it this way that unresolved issues have babies and they have lots of kinfolk. And real often, I had somebody last week explaining to me a situation with someone who was trying to jump track in their church. And I said, I think these people have cousins in Conroe because this is the nature of things.
Yeah.
Because we really want to just deny things a lot of time. We become emotionally paralyzed, mentally we lock down, and we get paralyzed with the reality of a crisis. And this is something that I don't know what to do. I don't want to do anything, but that'll cause more problems. So you have to do something. But when you realize that doing nothing only intensifies the pressure, the emotions, and the crisis. So when you're living in that moment of denial, and you've got an undealt with crisis, or God forbid if you've got undealt with crises, if you've got more than one, you've got to realize that this thing is multiplying on me, and if I don't do something, it's gonna keep on, and it's going to be bigger. These things don't go away, and that's the hard thing. Is I had two very good men in my life, um, my father and then Elder McLean. My dad was always quick to make a decision. Brother McLean never made a decision, and I watched the two different ministries operate with time, and I realized that dad sometimes made decisions too fast. But Brother McLean, many times wouldn't make a decision, and I watched the storm on both sides of that. And so I decided that along the way that these undealt with crises, these things we want to deny, they gather intensity, and it seems like the storm winds. It gets bigger and it gets bigger, and when it's getting bigger, it's like a storm. Um, you know, they watch the barometric pressure when the hurricane starts coming in, and it's like that. This big storm, it sucks everything
Hmm.
into it. And then I've watched a single crisis for a single person, a single thing that they could have dealt with better, and it become a crisis. And I've watched that single person storm become a vacuum where it pulls in multiple uh, people, multiple levels of leadership. It takes it's like when you get your baby and you bring it your first baby and you bring it home. You know, anybody can dress a baby and get out of the house, but that first time that that young couple takes that baby somewhere, it takes the mama, it takes the daddy, it might take both grandmas and an auntie or two
It's a whole
to
day
get out of the
process. Yeah.
house the first time,
Yeah.
because when you're in this crisis and it's undealt with, it creates this vacuum and it begins to pull others into it. And that's the reason I say that many times the crisis that we are faced with dealing with is not even our own. And when you're dealing with you just wish it was yours. But now you're in a storm because somebody else is in a storm. And you're in this situation and it drives you crazy. Um, I I watch these things happen and I've lived through them enough times to realize that denying it's not an answer. And it just creates more. So since I can't deny it, I know I can't deny it. I want to defer it. So if I choose to defer it, I, it's already happening anyway, because I found that when the storm's going on and I'm not making a decision, by making no decision, I'm actually making a
Yeah.
decision that this is being deferred. And then when I defer this problem, there's two things begin to happen. I begin to invite others in to solve my problem, help me with it. But what I don't want to happen, and this happens every time, I have those that I invite in, and then there are those who have invited themselves in. And so now I've asked others to join me. So invited or uninvited, there are more participants. And my storm now involves more than me, more than one person, more than one. Now I've not only do I have people I think can help me, but I have people who've been drawn into my crisis and they're providing commentary.
Mm.
And they're providing color. It's like that second guy on the broadcast at a football game. You hear one guy calling plays, and the other guy he's analyzing and he's dissecting. And so now I've got both. This happened to Job. He had three friends, and one of them was talking how great God was, and Job was such a good guy. The other guys were providing commentary that
Yeah.
you must be a scoundrel.
Hmm.
And so this happens when there is this denial. So we defer it. We don't make a decision. We actually make a decision, and the others are drawn into our crisis, invited or uninvited. They seem to come. You see, when we realize the issue is not going away, we find a way to draw others into it. So in the ministry or in leading of other people, um, we find ourselves pulled into not just problems of other people, but their ethical crisis. And we're tasked with trying to help them and coach them and carry them through. But when we're doing this, it's impossible not to do this. But we do this. We're drawn into their problem. And so we want to help them with their. So somehow when we let ourselves be drawn into their problem, what happens is we take partial ownership
Mm.
of their crisis. So this was theirs, but now that I'm trying to solve it, trying to direct traffic, suddenly it's no longer theirs, but it's ours, our problem. How are we going to do this? And so we wind up we were drawn into somebody's ethical crisis, and because we've assumed responsibility for it, and we have either enlisted or been enlisted into their issue. And I have found myself more than one time dealing with a crisis, and it become my own crisis. and somebody else's lack of ethics, somebody else's unresolved issue. And I found myself one time. I told myself that if you don't take control of your mind, you're going to go to hell over something you didn't even do because you're bent out of shape over somebody else. And because I was taken into myself, part of their crisis, part of their challenge, I was I was going to be lost over something somebody else did, and I hadn't even sinned, but well, I was full of rottenness. So when you consider this, um, we we we've either been enlisted or we have volunteered for the job to take on ownership by addressing their crisis. And whenever you take on somebody else's crisis, whenever you insert yourself or are involved in somebody else's problem, it never ends well.
Yeah.
It never ends well. As a pastor, you can be invited into somebody's situation. You can provide them godly counsel. For instance, I'm not a counselor, but as a pastor, I endeavor to offer pastoral care. But I recognize there are lines that I can't cross. So I've over the years, when I was a young pastor, I tried to solve everybody's problems, and hence I had all this chaos inside of me. But with time, I learned I can provide a certain amount of help, love, and support. But if they've got big problems, they need professional help and they need
That's right.
time at the altar.
That's right.
Now, I don't want to over spiritualize, but I found that most of our sin issues can be taken care of at an altar. But a lot of times we have the aftershocks. Just because we pray through doesn't mean we don't have the consequence of our sin. I mean, you might have smoked for years, and the Lord forgive you and save you, and you're on your way to heaven, but you might still have lung issues
Yeah.
as you age as a result of your habit. So there are consequences to the things that we do. So with that in mind, um, when we assume ownership of somebody else's crisis, we become drawn into it, and we suffer alongside them in their crisis. So what I've had to do over the years, the one thing that I personally do is I envision when I'm helping someone, I envision I've opened up a file drawer, I've pulled out a file, I opened it up, and then I help them for a few minutes. And then as they leave, I close the file, I put it in the drawer, and I close it. And I don't take it home with me. Now, I do know that, what's the book that men are from Mars and ladies from Venus, or
Mhm.
ladies are from Venus, men
Yeah.
are from Mars. And there's this whole thing that men live in boxes and drawers, and they
Compartmentalized.
keep all the boxes, and so they keep their work box and their personal box. But ladies are not that way. It's like a bowl of spaghetti. You start out over here, you just follow it everywhere. So my process works well for me, but it probably wouldn't work well for your mother or our dear pastoress Kayla, because they connect all the dots and the little minds never stop. And so you have to find a way to control your mind and not take ownership of someone else's problems. So that will move me then to the third step of dealing with of when I'm in crisis, what I do. And first off, you just have to learn to deal with it. We're presented with this. Let's fix it. This works good for me because I'm a fixer. And I want to open the drawer and fix it and close the drawer and let's go about our business. But you have to deal with it. And that's always the best option, to not deny it and not defer it. But let's just face our ethical issue. Whatever this crisis moment is, let's face it. Let's be honest with ourselves and let's deal with it. I think that you cannot really deal with your ethical crisis if you're not intellectually honest with
That's right.
yourself.
That's so good.
And if you're not and if you don't live with, it takes integrity to be able to face your realities
Mhm.
and deal with who you are. I mean, you're not going, as long as you can be 700 pounds in front of the mirror, and as long as you think that you're skinny and good looking, you're not going to lose a pound. But the bottom line is you've got to face your reality and deal with where you're at. So the third and best option is always to face the ethical issue, face the crisis, and immediately deal with it. Uh, how do we deal with it? Now, this is where we get, because we know it's going to be painful. This is where we find ourselves when I do this or do this, it's going to cost me something. So when we recognize this thing's not going away, we got to deal with it. Until we deal with it, it's just going to grow. But yet, this decision is going to have emotional ramifications, maybe leadership ramifications. And so you find yourself in this traumatic moment of doing nothing, of drawing others into your storm, or it's just as traumatic. It's no more traumatic to face it and deal with it than it is to dread it. As a matter of fact, if you'll face it and deal with it, you'll learn. And how many times have you done this? You've delayed a task. You've delayed a task because you dreaded doing it. And when you went to do it, it's over with in just a little bit of time. And then you so that wasn't as bad as I feared. And it wasn't as hurtful as I feared it. And why did I do this? Well, a lot of times I can't tell you the times that I have feared other people kicking me, but I realized that I didn't really have to fear other people kicking me because I was doing a pretty good job kicking myself.
Yeah, that's good.
So if you don't deal with these things, and if I defer the issues to others, it seems the storm, it seems to grow exponentially. I mean, instead of one problems, I've got three, and the three turns into 12. I mean, I don't even know how, but in a way that I can't really describe, that this thing grows exponentially. And there comes a moment that you have to stop, look this thing face to face and say, okay, we laugh and say, not today, devil, not on my watch. But that comes the moment when you say, okay, we're going to draw the line and we're going to face this thing right here. That's when you stand up and stop the crisis.
Good.
And that's the reason a lot of time a whole family, a whole church, a whole group can be in this boiling cauldron of a crisis. And a leader step in and he'll say, come now, let's reason together.
Yeah.
And it's solved in that instance. So somebody has to stand up and stop this thing. And so we celebrate the guy. We preach sermons about the one guy who stopped the armies, the one guy who stopped the onslaught, who stood in the face of wrong and stood for what was right. And we celebrate that guy in a sermon, but none of us want to be that guy in real life.
That's right.
Because that's a painful place to be. But in reality, we have to face our issues. We have to deal with our issues, and we have to make difficult decisions. And I wish life was such that all of the good decisions were just peachy. But it seems like the best decisions are painful, and that they cost us something. And if we finally arrive at the place where we can make this difficult decision, I'm amazed what happens when the wind stops blowing, the waves start tossing, and the storm is over. Because when a definitive leader gets up and says, this is not going to happen, this is the direction we're going to go, we're going to fix this. Jesus told the woman who was caught in adultery, okay, you're forgiven, now don't do this anymore. I like the little videos that I saw in times past of the family counselor. The lady comes in for $5. He gets the advice. He just yells at her, shut up or stop it. And so she starts again. He takes $5 more. He yells, stop it. And a lot of times we need that answer. Somebody needs to yell at us, stop it, behave yourself. Yeah. Because we have to stop the behaviors that causes the crisis. And then we have to find our way to deal with this. Now, Joseph is a great example of this. Joseph found himself in crisis that wasn't of his own making. I mean, Joseph was just a happy-go-lucky kid when his daddy decided he was going to be the favorite kid. Jacob decided, or Israel decided, Joseph is my favorite. So he gives him favors. I don't think that as a father, if I'd have given you a coat of many colors, you wouldn't have been too impressed with that. But had I come in with a Porsche,
probably would.
And your sister was driving an old Pinto.
Well, Redona drove Porsches. It just was. That's how many cars she had. The value added up. She kept on wrecking them.
23 wrecks. I agree.
She had enough Pintos to where she could have bought a Porsche.
So Joseph found himself the favorite kid, and his brothers resenting it, and he found himself in crisis because they didn't like what was happening inside of him. And so eventually they betray him, they sell him out, and he eventually finds himself at Potiphar's house. And as the blessings that are on Joseph, he begins to rise up and he's trusted. As a matter of fact, Potiphar trusted him with everything. He even trusted him with his wife.
Wow.
And so he Joseph had found this place of trust. But here he was in this situation. It was not optimum, even though for his reality, he wasn't in the dungeon at this point. So he was trusted, he was rising up, but he was in this position because some brothers couldn't settle some things in themselves.
Yeah.
And they deferred the issue by selling him out. Nobody ever faced the issue in themselves. So here he is. He's at Potiphar's house when Potiphar's wife takes a fancy to him.
Takes a fancy. That's good Southeast Texas right there.
She takes a fancy to him.
Yeah.
And
There's a
she
spiritual
begins,
issue,
if you
too.
read the story, she begins to daily reach for him. And now Joseph is faced with this crisis. Now it's a moral issue. It's a sin issue. But for the sake of this discussion, he was in an ethical crisis. Do I betray the trust of the one who trusted me and enjoy this because I can get away with it? Or do I do what is right and I run?
Wow.
Or I remove myself from this. And I think that he was very tempted because this wasn't like she was sending him an email tempting him, or she was texting him and tempting him. I mean, he was close enough to her that she reached out and grabbed him.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was more than just alluring. This was in the throes of a big moment crisis. And she had her hands on him. I mean, in our term, we might say she had her claws in him. But when she put her hands on him, he realizes my crisis is at a major, this is at DEFCON 3 or whatever the DEFCONs are. This is big. So he runs from the room, and she's so close to getting her claws in him that she had her claws in his coat, but she didn't have her claws in him. He runs. So here's what happens. He's faced with this decision. I can do nothing, and I can be drawn into this, or I can do what's right, and I can get out of this. But he's in that crisis, though, because when he runs and does right, he leaves his coat behind. And so he's in this place, and the real issue that he's dealing with is not even his issue. I mean, first off, probably he should have never been trusted in that situation, because it wasn't he couldn't be trusted, but Potiphar knew his wife, and he probably knew she couldn't be trusted. So here's this thing. So he shouldn't even be here. That's somebody else's crisis. This temptation shouldn't be going on. That's somebody else's issue. He shouldn't have had to run and save his life and leave his coat, but that's somebody else's issue. But he's trying to deal with his crisis he's in, and it's not even his. And so he's dealing with the real issue that he was dealing with was everybody else. This crisis that she was tempted to be disloyal to her husband, disloyal to her vow, unfaithful and seductive. There are sin issues involved there, but there's a crisis within herself that allowed this to happen. Her crisis became his crisis. And how many times as a leader have you found somebody else's crisis becoming your crisis? It's hard. It's hard to separate that. So with this, let me just tell you a personal story. Years ago, it was like on a Monday night, we decided that we got a babysitter, and your mother and I were going to go across town and have dinner. And you probably, well, let's don't put a time thing on it, but you were of the age that you needed supervision, and your sister needed supervision. So we were gone, and we got a message. It seemed like it was maybe a text message or maybe a beeper message, but we were called back here for somebody was in trouble. When we arrived here, there was somebody that had come into the church, and they were laying across the front doors of the church inside. I didn't know that. So when I opened the door to walk in the building, this person's laying out across the front door, and I can't walk in. And they jump up, and this is the person who is in crisis, and they've called us back. And so they ask if we can go in the office, and this person began to make all sort of accusations, just um, wild and crazy and uncomfortable and undeserved accusations against myself, your mother, and other church members. And it was a whole mess. And I tried to get out of that, and I tried to get rid of the person that night. But finally, I was able to withdraw myself from this situation for the evening. But the next day, I sought counsel. So I called Brother Kilgore. He was our district superintendent. I've just put time on this, okay? But I called Brother Kilgore, and he gives me some advice. So he suggested that I bring my leadership team together and explain to them what had happened and what was going on, and just ask them to pray. Just be upfront with it. So I did. It was a Wednesday. By now it's a Wednesday. So I call the leadership team. By that time, we had several during those years. We had 2 or 3 ministers on staff in those years. And so we went over there to the school building, and we met in remember that little room we had lockers in?
Mhm.
I set up chairs in there, and we had a little leadership meeting over in that building. And I explained to them what was said and what were the accusations were. And this stuff is unfounded, but the only thing I know to do is be open about this, and let's get this out. And I needed the leadership team of the church to understand that I was facing this. I wasn't avoiding this, and I got it right out in the open. And then we prayed together. Well, it's probably not a real good prayer meeting. I mean, because now
Everybody's world's rocked.
these
Yeah.
leaders are all rocked because they're hearing this crazy stuff about the pastor and his wife and other people, and they're hearing all this crazy stuff. And so we pray for 5 or 10 minutes, and we break this meeting up, and then we come over to Wednesday night, worship and Bible lesson. And those days we didn't have many visitors because we didn't have money. So we started the service, and while the worship was going on, about the time that the worship was coming down and I was stepping to the pulpit to do my lesson, the back door of the church opens, and a prophet walks in. And this man had been used here in the past very prophetically. And I never knew, matter of fact, he didn't even live in the United States. He lived 1,000 countries away. And so I didn't even know he was in the U.S. But this prophet walks in, whom I had relationship with and whom the church had grown to respect because they'd seen the fruit of his ministry. When I see him coming in, he comes in the church door and veers around to the left side of the sanctuary and walking up that wall. I made eye contact with him, and I never said a word. I just stepped back to the pulpit and put my hand out to him like this. And he never stopped walking. He went in and walked down the left-hand wall to the right hand of the pulpit. He walks all the way up on the stage. And he doesn't say anything, doesn't say, "Good to see everybody." This is what he does. He said, he grabs a microphone. This was still the days we had the old gooseneck type mic,
Yeah.
And so he got that thing all adjusted up and got it pulled to where it was just right. He looks around and he pursed his lips and said, "I don't know what's going on around here today, but God told me to come and tell this church that the things that's being said about the church, about the pastor and his family and other people are all lies."
Wow.
And he sent me to tell you to trust the pastor, trust the man of God, and whatever has happened, it's all untruthful. Well, the leadership team that 15 minutes before, 20 minutes before, had been over in this meeting. You just heard the audible gasp in the room. And this man then turned around, and he walked off the stage, down the aisle, and out the door. And I don't even know how many years ago that's been. It's been a lot of years. But that man has never been back to this church again.
Wow.
Now, I have a relationship with him, and I've seen him over the years, but he's never been back here. And he came on a mission. He came on a mission. And what I was fearful would be a terrible crisis was solved in day 2, because it started on Tuesday, and by Wednesday, at least it's a crisis for me. It might not have been a crisis for anyone else, but I chose, let's be proactive, let's be open, let's be honest, let's share the truth. And God sent a prophet. Now, God doesn't always send a prophet. I mean, he doesn't always send it, but I'm sharing you that I live with this promise that if I'm open, if I'm honest, if I'm transparent, if I face issues and I deal with them in the right timing, in the right moment, that God always provides validation. He always
Hey,
does
my
this.
appointment's here, so we're going to have to wrap this up and get to part 2. So thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Hope for the Soul podcast. Next week, we are going to continue this conversation with part 2 of the anatomy of, what's the subject?
Anatomy of an ethical crisis.
The anatomy of an ethical crisis. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.